three conflicts appear to be unfolding at the same time. Iran is exchanging military pressure with the United States while still keeping diplomatic talks alive. Russia and Ukraine are moving beyond the battlefield and targeting ports, ships, energy routes, and daily economic life. And inside Kyiv, leadership changes are raising new questions about military strategy, public confidence, and the story being presented to Western partners. These events may look separate, but they are connected by one central idea. Modern wars are no longer fought only with soldiers, missiles, and drones. They are also fought through trade routes, energy prices, public opinion, political stability, and the control of information. And in each of these conflicts, the most important target may not be a military base. It may be the system that allows the enemy to keep fighting. The confrontation between Iran and the United States offers a clear example. At first sight, Iran's behavior may seem contradictory. Iranian forces warn that attacks could expand if American strikes resume. At the same time, Iranian diplomats continue discussions with Oman about the Strait of Hormuz. But these two actions do not necessarily conflict. For Iran, military force and negotiation can operate together. The strikes create pressure. Diplomacy offers a possible way to release that pressure. One does not have to stop before the other begins. This approach is based on escalation as a form of communication. A simple military response would mean answering one attack with another attack of similar size. Iran's strategy appears more complex. Each new round can expand either in location or in intensity. The first form is geographic escalation. Instead of limiting the response to one attacker or one military site, Iran can threaten a wider network of bases, ports, radar systems, and support facilities across the Gulf region. This places pressure not only on the United States, but also on countries that host American forces. The second form is escalation in force. The range, speed, number, or destructive power of the weapons can increase over time. Drones may be followed by missiles. A symbolic strike may be followed by an attack against a more valuable military system. The purpose is not always to achieve a total military victory. It may be to make the cost of continuing the conflict rise faster than the political value of staying in it. This is an important distinction. Iran does not need to defeat the entire American military. It only needs to make the regional presence of American forces more expensive, more dangerous, and harder to defend. That could slowly push aircraft, personnel, and equipment away from the Gulf. It could also force Washington to spread its air defenses across many countries and installations. In strategic terms, Iran may be trying to reduce the number and usefulness of American bases in the region. Iranian authorities have claimed major successes against aircraft, radar systems, command centers, and support equipment. Those claims are difficult to confirm independently, and they should not be treated as proven facts without outside evidence. But even without accepting every number, the general strategy is clear. Iran is focusing on expensive systems that are difficult to replace and essential to American operations. Radar units, air defense batteries, command centers, fuel aircraft, and surveillance platforms are not always the most visible parts of a military force. Yet they allow the entire force to function. Destroying one support system can sometimes have a greater effect than destroying several combat vehicles. This also explains Iran's use of both missiles and drones. Missiles can deliver speed, range, and heavy destructive power. Drones can approach from different directions, remain in the air longer, and force air defenses to use costly interceptors. When these weapons are used together, they create a difficult problem. A defender must decide which objects are real threats, which ones are decoys, and which systems should be used against them. Even a drone that does not reach its target may still have value if it forces the defender to reveal a radar location or fire an expensive missile. Iran is often described as dependent on outside military help. Russian intelligence support is one possibility that has been discussed, especially because Western countries provide intelligence and targeting support to Ukraine. However, there is no need to assume that every accurate Iranian strike must depend on Russia. Iran has spent years developing its own surveillance and drone systems. Its observation satellites may not match the most advanced American platforms, but a country does not need a perfect image to locate a large airfield, port, radar site, or group of ships. A position accurate to a few meters may be enough for several military tasks. Iran has also built a wide range of unmanned aircraft. The best-known Iranian drones are the low-cost systems used in large numbers. But Iran has also worked on stealthier designs, including aircraft influenced by foreign technology captured or recovered in the past. The important lesson is not that every Iranian system is advanced. It is that Iran has designed its force around the type of war it expects to fight. A country preparing for a major ground invasion may invest heavily in tanks and large land formations. Iran faces a different problem. It expects attacks from aircraft, ships, missiles, and distant bases. Its answer has been to invest in long-range weapons, mobile launchers, drones, electronic warfare, surveillance, and systems designed to attack radar networks. This does not make Iran unbeatable. It does make the country more capable than the image of a weak and outdated military would suggest. Underestimating that capability can produce serious mistakes. The Strait of Hormuz is central to this situation. A large share of the world's oil and gas trade passes through this narrow waterway. Any major disruption can affect energy prices far beyond the Middle East. Iran has often threatened the strait, but completely closing it would also damage Iran and many of its trading partners. A more realistic objective may be controlled access rather than total closure. Iran could try to inspect, delay, discourage, or selectively block traffic that it believes supports hostile military operations. Even the possibility of such action can raise shipping and insurance costs. Oman is important because it has often acted as a bridge between Iran and Western powers. It shares responsibility for the area around the strait and has an interest in preventing a wider regional war. This creates an unusual situation. Iran can attack American interests while negotiating with Oman over maritime security. From a Western point of view, war and negotiation are often presented as two separate choices. But in practice, many governments negotiate while fighting. Diplomacy does not always begin after violence ends. Sometimes it begins because violence has created new pressure. This is one of the main patterns linking the Gulf conflict to the war in Ukraine. Force is being used not only to destroy targets, but to change the conditions of future talks. In Ukraine, the conflict is also moving further into the economic system. As important military and industrial sites become better protected, the attacker faces a choice. It can continue trying to reach difficult targets, or it can move towards softer ones. A soft target may have less direct military value, but it is easier to reach and can still create fear, disruption, and political pressure. Recent attacks on warehouses, commercial facilities, ships, and transport routes suggest that the economic side of the war is becoming more important. This shift carries serious risks. When military operations expand into civilian trade networks, the line between economic warfare and attacks on ordinary life becomes less clear. A warehouse may support civilian commerce. A port may export grain while also receiving military supplies. A tanker may carry oil owned by a country that is not directly involved in the conflict. Each target becomes part of a larger argument. One side calls it essential infrastructure. The other describes it as part of the enemy's war effort. The port of Odesa is a good example. For Ukraine, Odesa is a vital link to international markets. It allows the country to export grain and other goods by sea. That income matters greatly because much of Ukraine's industrial base has been damaged, occupied, or placed close to the front. For Russia, the same port may also be viewed as a route through which weapons and military equipment can enter Ukraine. Some claims about weapons arriving by commercial ships remain disputed, but ports almost always have both civilian and strategic value during a major war. This makes them attractive targets and dangerous points of escalation. The grain question has already caused an international crisis once before. Early in the war, Ukraine's maritime exports fell sharply. Mines, military risks, shipping restrictions, sanctions, and fear among commercial carriers all contributed to the problem. The United Nations and Turkey later helped create an agreement that allowed Ukrainian grain to move through the Black Sea. The arrangement also included promises related to Russian food and fertilizer exports. Russian grain itself was not always directly banned, but sanctions on banking, insurance, shipping services, and maritime companies still made Russian exports more difficult. This reveals an important feature of modern sanctions. A product may technically remain legal while the services required to transport, finance, insure, or purchase it are restricted. The result can be close to an indirect ban. Both Russia and Ukraine used the grain issue in their public messaging. Each side blamed the other for threatening food supplies to poorer countries. The reality was more complex. Ukraine had mined parts of its coast because it feared a Russian landing. Russia controlled important areas of the Black Sea and could threaten commercial traffic. Western sanctions affected Russian shipping. Insurance companies were reluctant to enter a war zone. No single cause explains the entire crisis. What matters now is that attacks on commercial ships could bring the same problem back in a more dangerous form. Shipping companies do not need an official blockade before they stop operating. If the risk of losing a ship becomes too high, insurers increase their prices or refuse coverage. Crews may not accept the route. Port operators may suspend service. Large carriers may decide that the possible profit is not worth the danger. At that point, trade can collapse without any navy formally announcing that the sea is closed. This is especially damaging for Ukraine because rail transport cannot fully replace maritime trade. Ships can move huge amounts of grain, fuel, and equipment at relatively low cost. Rail systems carry less and require more infrastructure. Ukraine also uses a wider railway gauge inherited from the Soviet period. Much of Western Europe uses a narrower gauge. Cargo crossing the border may therefore need to be transferred to different trains or placed on different wool systems. Solutions exist, but they take time. A process that is manageable for normal trade becomes a major bottleneck when it must replace a large share of a country's seaborne exports. If only a fraction of the former maritime volume can move by rail, Ukraine loses income, storage facilities fill up, and agricultural producers face lower prices at home. The damage then spreads beyond the port. Farmers earn less. The government collects less tax. Foreign currency becomes harder to obtain. European border systems become more crowded. Global food markets lose part of their supply. The economic war does not stop with grain. Attacks near Russian ports have also affected routes used to export oil from Kazakhstan. This is important because the oil may pass through Russian territory without belonging to Russia. Kazakhstan relies on pipelines and terminals connected to the Russian port of Novorossiysk. when those facilities or nearby tankers are attacked. Kazakh exports can be delayed even though Kazakhstan is not a direct party to the war. This creates diplomatic problems for Ukraine. A strike meant to weaken Russian income can also harm a third country, European buyers, international shipping firms, and consumers far from the battlefield. The same problem appears with pipelines crossing Ukraine. Closing or damaging one route may reduce Russian energy flows, but it may also affect Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, or other countries that still depend on those supplies. Energy systems are deeply connected. Oil from one country may travel through another country's pipeline, leave from a third country's port, use a ship registered in a fourth country, and be insured by a company in a fifth. A military action against one part of that chain can affect all of them. Europe is especially exposed. European governments have spent years reducing their dependence on Russian energy. This goal is understandable from a security point of view. A country does not want a possible enemy to control a vital resource. But replacing a large energy supplier is not simple. New terminals must be built. Ships must be found. Contracts must be signed. Pipelines may need to be expanded. Industries must adapt to higher or less stable prices. When several supply routes are disrupted at the same time, the cost rises even faster. Tension in the Strait of Hormuz threatens Gulf energy flows. Problems around the Black Sea affect Russian and Kazakh exports. Pipeline closures reduce deliveries into Central Europe. Meanwhile, sanctions limit which sellers, ships, banks, and insurers European companies can use. Each policy may have a clear purpose on its own. Together, they can create a shortage. Oil is traded in a global market. Removing barrels from that market does not remove demand. Buyers compete for what remains, and the price usually rises. Higher prices hurt households through fuel and heating costs. They also hurt transport, farming, manufacturing, chemicals, steel, and many other industries. European companies already face higher energy costs than some of their competitors. If those costs continue to rise, production may move to countries where energy is cheaper. A policy designed to weaken an opponent can then weaken domestic industry as well. Price caps create a similar challenge. A government can declare that it will not pay more than a certain amount for oil. But the seller is not forced to accept that offer if other buyers are willing to pay more. The cap can work only if the countries enforcing it control enough of the shipping, insurance, banking, and purchasing system to limit the seller's alternatives. If Russia can redirect more oil toward Asia, a European price cap may reduce Europe's own access without greatly reducing Russian sales. The effect depends on enforcement, transport capacity, buyer demand, and the discount Russia must offer. This does not mean sanctions never work. It means they often produce costs on both sides, and those costs must be measured honestly. The conflict over Russian fuel shortages shows why honest measurement matters. Ukraine has attacked refineries, fuel depots, tankers, and distribution systems. These attacks can clearly reduce supply in some areas and increase the cost of moving fuel. But Russia also had seasonal and regional fuel shortages long before the present war. Its distribution system contains old weaknesses. Agricultural demand rises during the harvest season. Refining and transport capacity are not equal in every region. Smaller private fuel companies may have less reliable access than large national firms. Crimea faces an additional problem because major Russian companies have historically limited some activities there to reduce their exposure to international sanctions. This leaves the region more dependent on smaller distributors. Ukrainian strikes can make these problems worse. but describing every fuel shortage as a direct result of military action would give an incomplete picture. This is where information becomes part of the war. A real event can be presented without its wider context. A long-standing weakness can be shown as a new battlefield victory. A local shortage can be described as a national collapse. The event itself may be real. The meaning attached to it may be exaggerated. Every side does this because public belief has strategic value. Military theory uses the term center of gravity to describe the main source of an opponent's strength. It does not simply mean the largest army, the most powerful weapon, or the most important building. A center of gravity is the thing on which the wider system depends. If that point is weakened, the rest of the system becomes harder to maintain. For Russia, one possible center of gravity is domestic stability. The Russian government has tried to keep daily life as normal as possible for most of the population. Shops remain open. Public services continue. The economy adapts. The war is presented as something controlled and distant rather than a total national emergency. This helps explain why attacks on commercial buildings, transport systems, fuel supplies, and cities may have strategic value for Ukraine. The goal is not only to destroy property. It is to make Russian citizens feel the cost of the war and question whether their government can protect normal life. On paper, this logic makes sense. If public stability supports Russia's ability to continue the war, then disrupting that stability could weaken the state. But strategy also depends on scale and public reaction. A limited attack may not turn citizens against their government. It may instead increase anger toward the attacker. Rather than weakening national unity, attacks on civilian or commercial targets can strengthen it. The same action can therefore produce the opposite of the intended result. It may also trigger stronger retaliation. When a government believes that its central source of stability is being attacked, it has a reason to respond in a highly visible way. Strikes against Ukrainian ports, industrial facilities, military exhibitions, and transport routes can serve both a practical and political purpose. They destroy resources, but they also send a message. The message is that attacks on Russian daily life will bring greater pressure on Ukraine's economic system. Ukraine has a different center of gravity. Its ability to continue the war depends heavily on outside support. That support includes money, weapons, intelligence, training, industrial capacity, and political backing. To keep that support, Ukraine must show that continued assistance can still produce results. This creates a powerful need for a convincing public narrative. Ukraine must present itself as capable of resisting Russia, adapting to setbacks, and imposing meaningful costs on its opponent. If Western governments and citizens become convinced that the situation is hopeless, pressure for negotiations may grow. Funding may slow. Weapons deliveries may become more difficult to approve. Information is therefore not a secondary part of Ukraine's war effort. It is one of its main strategic resources. That does not mean every positive Ukrainian claim is false, nor does it mean every Russian claim is true. It means both sides have strong reasons to select facts that support their goals. Early in the war, many officials and commentators predicted that Russia would quickly run out of missiles, equipment, money, or trained soldiers. Some of those predictions were based on real Russian weaknesses. Others were too confident. Russia suffered major losses and serious failures. But it also adapted, increased production, changed tactics, and continued launching long-range attacks. When optimistic predictions repeatedly fail, they create a problem. Leaders may begin making decisions based on the image they created instead of the reality they face. This is one of the greatest dangers of propaganda. Propaganda may strengthen morale for a time. But if decision-makers believe their own message, they can underestimate the enemy and delay necessary changes. A military can survive bad publicity. It may not survive bad planning based on false assumptions. Questions about Ukraine's leadership must be viewed in this context. Changes among defense officials and senior commanders do not automatically prove that the state is collapsing. Governments replace military leaders during long wars for many reasons. There may be disagreements over strategy, command style, mobilization, battlefield performance, relations with allies, or control of resources. Still, repeated changes at the top suggest that pressure is increasing. A government usually avoids replacing successful leaders unless it believes a different approach is needed. Public protests against forced recruitment add another source of strain. Ukraine needs soldiers to hold a long front against a larger population. But mobilization places a heavy burden on families and communities, especially after years of casualties and displacement. The state needs more personnel. The public wants fairness, clear rules, and some limit to the sacrifice. Those needs are difficult to balance. Internal debate is also becoming more visible. Ukrainian journalists, activists, and political figures have begun reviewing earlier claims about Russian weakness and Ukrainian success. Some are asking whether the public and Ukraine's partners received an overly hopeful picture of the war. This does not necessarily mean support for Russia. Criticism of wartime messaging can also come from people who want Ukraine to make better decisions. A country cannot correct its strategy unless it can discuss what is failing. But open debate creates another political risk. If Ukraine's leaders admit that conditions are worse than previously stated, Western partners may question further support. If they continue presenting an overly positive picture, they may lose credibility later. The government is caught between military reality and political need. Europe faces a similar dilemma. European governments want to protect Ukraine, prevent a forced settlement, and discourage future military aggression. They also want to avoid direct war with Russia and protect their own economies. These goals do not always point in the same direction. More weapons may help Ukraine defend itself, but they may also extend the conflict without creating a clear path to victory. Stronger sanctions may reduce Russia's options, but they may also raise European energy costs. Refusing negotiations may prevent Russia from gaining advantages through pressure, but waiting too long may leave Ukraine in a weaker position later. There's no simple answer. The key question is whether current policy is improving Ukraine's long-term position or only helping it survive from one crisis to the next. Critics argue that Europe has adopted the goal of weakening Russia without clearly defining what success would look like for Ukraine. If the war continues mainly to reduce Russian power, then Ukrainians carry most of the human and physical cost. That is a serious moral and strategic problem. Support for Ukraine should be judged not only by the amount of money or weapons delivered. It should also be judged by whether it moves the country toward a secure and sustainable future. A strategy that protects Ukraine must consider its population, economy, territory, political stability, and ability to rebuild. Keeping the war going is not automatically the same as helping Ukraine win. Ending it quickly is not automatically the same as creating peace. A poor agreement could simply delay another war. An endless war could destroy the country it is supposed to protect. This brings us back to the link between the three conflicts. Iran uses controlled escalation to raise the cost of the American military presence while keeping negotiation possible. Russia and Ukraine attack trade routes, energy systems, and public stability because economic pressure can shape the battlefield. Ukraine and its partners fight to control the story of the war because international support depends partly on what people believe is still possible. Missiles, markets, and narratives are no longer separate weapons. They are parts of the same strategy. The danger is that each side may become trapped by its own method. Iran may escalate to force negotiations only to trigger a larger regional war. Ukraine may attack Russian stability only to strengthen Russian public anger and invite harsher retaliation. Russia may increase economic pressure only to deepen Western involvement. Europe may try to weaken Russia only to weaken its own industry and exhaust Ukraine. And every government may defend its public story long after the fact beneath that story have changed. That may be the most important center of gravity of all. Because once a war depends on a certain version of reality being believed, the next major target may not be a port, a pipeline, a radar station, or a military base. It may be reality itself.